Welcome to Shield Maidens, Women of the Norse World, the podcast that celebrates the remarkable women of the Viking Age. From fierce warriors and powerful queens to wise seers and cunning goddesses, these women left an indelible mark on history. Join authors Johanna Wittenberg and K.S. Barton each month as we explore the stories, achievements, and impact of Norse women. Welcome to Shield Maidens, Women of the Norse World. This is episode 29, in which Johanna and I welcome historian and writer Pamela D. Toler, author of Women Warriors, An Unexpected History, and The Dragon from Chicago, The Untold Story of an American Reporter in Nazi Germany. I'm K.S. Barton, the author of the Norse Family Trilogy, in which a young Viking woman and a Viking warrior are caught in a deadly blood feud between two brothers. And with me is Johanna Wittenberg. Hi, Johanna.
Hi, I'm
How are
Johanna
you?
Wittenberg, author of the Norse Women series, story of a real Norse queen who ruled alone in the early Viking Age.
Our guest today, Pamela Toler, armed with a PhD in history, a well-thumbed deck of library cards, and a large bump of curiosity, author, speaker, and historian Pamela D. Toler translates history for a popular audience. She goes beyond the familiar boundaries of American history to tell stories from other parts of the world as well as history from the other side of the battlefield, the gender line, or the color bar. Toler is the author of 10 books of popular history for children and adults, including Heroines of Mercy Street, Real Nurses of the Civil War, Women Warriors, An Unexpected History, and The Dragon from Chicago, The Untold Story of an American Reporter in Nazi Germany. Her work has appeared in American Scholar, Aramco World, Calliope, History Channel Magazine, MHQ, the Quarterly Journal of Military History, Ms., Time.com, and The Washington Post, and has been featured in National Geographic. Phew! So we've invited Pamela to talk with us about her book, Women Warriors. From Vikings and African queens to cross-dressing military doctors and World War II Russian fighter pilots, Women Warriors reclaims lost stories of women for whom battle was not a metaphor, debunking the pervasive claim that women do not and should not fight. So welcome, Pamela. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I always love a chance to talk about these women and their stories.
Yay. Well, as I was reading the bio, I was thinking, I really would like to read the Heroines of Mercy Street. I haven't checked that one out, the one about the Civil War. I did a lot of studying of the Civil War when I was an undergraduate. Yeah, you've a wide range of
I have written about a lot of things, but
Nice.
Increasingly I'm writing about women whose stories are undertold.
Yes, great. And we love that here.
Yes, we do.
So back to Women Warriors. That was quite a feat. You highlighted so many women from all over the world and from many different time periods. So out of the thousands of stories that you found, how did you decide which ones to include in the book?
Well, part of it was I really did want it to be a global history, and I didn't want it to just be the stories of queens and high-profile heroines. I wanted to look at women from all over the world. I wanted to look at, I guess for want of a better word, I'll call everyday women. And so I made sure that I chose stories from everywhere, with a wide variety. But it also meant I had to have enough sources for any individual woman to be able to tell the story, because an awful lot of the women, we have sort of one sentence, or we have a statue somewhere commemorating a deed with no details. And even for the women I wrote about, some of the sources are pretty thin. I mean, a 300-word paragraph. I can work with that if I have to, particularly if I'm putting it in a larger context. The hardest choices for me were really the women who actually led armies, because there's such a wide range of what that definition could be. I mean, you've got Queen Elizabeth with her little silver piece of armor on, waving the troops off, and all the way to, Joan of Arc going up the wall. So I ended up deciding they had to be what the military now calls combatant commanders,
Mm.
which meant women who literally are in the field of battle making command decisions. That meant some of my favorite people got left out, either because they didn't quite meet the definition or the sources I could get my hands on didn't suggest they meet the definition.
Is there someone who you really wanted to include but couldn't because she wasn't a combatant?
Sure, the Empress Matilda,
Oh
Oh
yeah,
yeah.
love her
who
story.
I love her story, and her story ends up paralleling another story I couldn't include, a woman in Hungary who had the same basic sense. It was starts from the same place where it's a woman whose father names her his successor, and then after his death, the nobles try and keep her out. The woman in Hungary manages to successfully keep the role, but neither one of them could I actually prove that they led troops.
Mm.
Um, so those are other stories for other days.
Yeah, yeah, she has Matilda has an interesting story. That made me think about I'm not going to remember her name. It was one of the Chinese women whose father, when she died, he wanted to give her like a military burial and everything, and people were balking at that. And he was just like, she led troops, she was in battle, she is going to get this, which I really
Yeah.
I like that you included that her father kind of like had her
Yeah,
back
I
after she
loved
died.
that story because, it's Princess Pingyang and she's definitely real. She's part of helps found the Ming Dynasty. And her father and her husband tell her to stay back. They're going to go fight. And she rounds up her troops and goes out and is part of them winning the battle. It's a great story. And
It was.
I also love the fact that he acknowledged that.
Mhm.
And she's an example of one of the things that I saw that came up over and over again, where they end up saying, and then she was just so tired, she died. And in one of the cases, they said it like after she'd been a military ruler for 30 years. They said she was just so tired, she died. It would be one thing to
Imagine
see it
that.
once, but when you begin to see it a dozen times in different stories, it's one of those weird. I mean, that's one of the things about this is you have these women's stories, different times, different places, and yet these strange themes that appear over and over that are clearly tropes about why people are thinking it's weird for women to do this.
In the Viking stories, a lot of times they end up saying she was happily married and took up needlepoint.
Mhm.
Something
Probably,
about
well, she's
needlepoint.
got something sharp and sticky and she's poking it through something. Whether she was happy about it, who knows?
Well, it's almost like in that context, those male writers were probably feeling like, well, she's, she took up needlepoint, it might as well just be tired and die, right?
That's right.
Maybe she was tired of needlepoint and
That's
that's
Good.
what got her
possible.
in.
Yeah, no kidding. Could you imagine though, after fighting in an actual battle, then just being like, okay, I'm gonna go home and take up needlepoint?
Not very likely.
Yeah.
Though, in all fairness, men who fight, particularly frontline men who are not professional soldiers, when the war is over, they go home and take up whatever.
True.
Mm.
So we have to remember that.
Yeah.
They're glad
Yeah.
it's over.
They're glad it's over. The war was a temporary part of their life, and they go back.
But I imagine, especially in some of the more warrior-like cultures, that I know I did a bunch of research about PTSD
Hmm.
and showing that, in more warrior-like cultures, honor cultures, that they didn't have it as much because when they had rituals around coming back, it was a
Hmm.
respected thing for people to go off and do. And so when they reintegrated, it wasn't as like of a harsh
Right.
like it
They
is
were
now.
expected to put the whole thing aside.
Right. And I just got me just now just got me curious, like how would the women have reintegrated? Like would they have suffered some PTSD because they maybe didn't get the rituals and the re-entry,
Mhm.
festivities maybe as much as the men did. Not that not that we
And,
have the answers to
and
that,
they
but
and they may have if it were one of those cultures that actually had a space for them. Yeah, there's so many questions. Every time I get ready to talk about this stuff, I end up with new questions or new thoughts that will at most show up in a blog post somewhere
Yeah. Or your newsletter.
or a newsletter,
Yeah,
right?
Pamela has a great newsletter too, if you. Well, and I really thought it was interesting the way you broke the chapters up into like these themes. Because when I picked up the book, I was just thinking it was just going to be, just here's a story about this woman and this woman, but it was very cleverly organized, like Womaning the Ramparts, The Widow's Rampage, which was one of my favorite titles, and the Joan of Arc of fill in the blank. So did you decide on that, or did you work with your
I
publisher?
absolutely decided on that. That was part of my proposal because when I
Nice.
started out working on this, I knew I didn't want to just do a collection of standalone stories. Number one, there are books out there that do that, but also the problem with that is they focus on each woman's heroic achievements and then it isolates them so that
Mm.
each woman stands apart. And when you do that, it's really easy to just think of each one as what historian John Keegan memorably call insignificant exceptions. So I was
Hmm.
really determined to look at what I had as a whole and see if there were patterns. So I didn't start out with the chapters. What I started out with were several hundred stories that I had collected over a period of 30 years. And took each story and said, okay, what themes are in here? Not just what happens, but why is she doing it? Who she is in society, and built a nice nerdy spreadsheet. And it was themes began to pop out, and there were women who clearly belonged in more than one category. But it meant I had real stories that a way to show how stories went across cultures, that widows picking up when their husband die and going to war either to defend his kingdom or yeah, usually to defend his kingdom and hold it together, sometimes just for her own power, but that happens in a lot of times in a lot of places. And then the part that got added later were the little in the small chapters called checkpoints that told the stories of one woman. Because as I was going through, there were women whose stories were really important, but that didn't quite fit in one of the chapters. There'd be a chapter, and this woman would be off at kind of an angle, or ended up just being a story that was so big that it took over a whole chapter. So that got added in later to deal with those stories that I also wanted to tell. But yeah, I was sure from the beginning I did not want to simply do a collection of mini biographies.
I think it really added a lot of depth to the book. I mean, it arranged it in a very interesting way to
But
see those commonalities of why women would be fighting. I mean, men do it for similar reasons too, but women had different reasons, like the widow or whatever.
mhm.
So yeah, it was a really interesting way of organizing it.
Well, your research process is really fascinating. This book must have been a huge project. And can you tell us about your process of researching and maybe what challenges you faced and what
Sure.
sources you used?
Well, first, process is such an orderly word for what I did. But again, I started with those stories I'd been collecting. I really started after reading, I read Antonia Fraser's Warrior Queens, 1988. I'd already been kind of fascinated by the idea, but that book really opened a door for me about how women had fought in a lot more times and places than I had realized. And it's like the blue Ford phenomenon, where once you buy a blue Ford truck, you start seeing blue Ford trucks everywhere. Well, once I had that opening, I started running into these stories, and I just collected them. I wrote down notes from museum exhibits or whatever I found. And 30 years later, I had a really fat file folder, but it also seemed like it was a time when the world was starting to be interested in the topic. So I started with those stories again, just like finding the themes, but also going back and finding out what sources there were for those women. Because this was very much a library-based research process. I mean, I did not go to a bazillion archives for this stuff. It was what was there. And some of them, there were full-scale academic monographs, and some of them there were footnotes that you traced through. And then one of them would lead to another. I would read books like Janine Kimball Davis's Woman Warrior, where the titles all end up being similar, but her archaeological book about finding women warriors is excellent. And in her footnotes, I found people I didn't know. So it ends up being like working your way through a maze, or even more like untangling a ball of yarn to see where the threads go. But yeah, it was an enormous process. And I literally would max out 3 different library cards pretty regularly. It's like, okay, which book do I have to get back now?
I love hearing historians talk about their process because it's like you're a detective, right? You're finding these little clues, and then that maybe leads you to somewhere else, and then that leads you to another clue, and maybe you find something that nobody else has unearthed. I just love to imagine doing
Right.
that in
And sometimes you really do find something nobody else has seen before. In this case, I mean, obviously, because I was working almost entirely with secondary sources or with printed versions of primary sources, somebody had seen it before, but not necessarily putting it together in the way I was putting it together. If some of the Chinese women are included in their husband's story.
Mm.
They're an aside, or they're there as a horrible example. So that you're picking out something and using it in a way that it's never been used before.
There's some of those in Norse legends and stuff about these women who are bad examples,
But
even they
also the
weren't doing anything.
Anglo-Saxon women were
Yeah,
really vilified.
even though they weren't doing anything different than what the men were doing.
Well, and that vilified is a great word, because in a lot of the sources end up being written long after the fact, at least when we're talking about ancient women, medieval women, and they're often written by the descendants of people who fought against them. So, there's a lot of trash talking going on, and there's a lot of saying, oh, she was frigid, or oh, she was sexually rapacious. You can't win with
Mm.
sex if you're a
Yeah.
warrior in the ancient world. That's so that there's an awful lot of negative additions to stories that you've got to wind your way through. And some of them may, in fact, have been, well, some of them were horrible people. There's no doubt about that. This book is not meant to be shining examples for teenage girls who are looking for
Role models.
role models. I loved those books particularly as a preteen, but this is not that book. A lot of these women did not lead exemplary lives.
Yeah, but neither did so many of the men and kings and
Yeah,
generals that we
Precisely.
follow either. I mean, Thomas
Yeah.
Jefferson had slaves, so and our country holds him up pretty highly. Women just get it. There's just a double standard.
All the way.
absolutely.
Did you go anywhere? Did you travel anywhere? It's fun
Um,
to research anything?
no, I really didn't. I make heavy use of interlibrary loan.
Oh, yes.
I spent
One
a
of the
lot
best
of
things
time.
ever.
It is.
Absolutely. The Pritzker Military Library was a glorious place to work, but it was right in downtown Chicago. I must say they were just wonderful. The head of the head research librarian said, "Think of us as your graduate student assistants. How can we help?"
Nice.
But yeah, I didn't get to travel anywhere exotic. This
Well,
was a
that
bus pass kind of book.
I'm sure the librarians loved that. Loved helping.
Yeah, I don't know what I would have done without interlibrary loans back at the beginning because I worked at a college library at the time and I was able to get books that maybe wouldn't normally be loaned out because, the library was there to back me.
Yeah.
It's
Well,
different.
Yeah.
and realistically, I used the University of Chicago's library, and that's a major
Hmm.
research library.
Yeah.
So lots of stuff.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank goodness for libraries.
Right.
And
Yeah.
Joan,
Any of the listeners who are doing any research and you haven't tried the interlibrary loan, if your library does it, make good use of it. It's fantastic.
And even if they sometimes charge you for it, it's still worth it
yeah.
because otherwise, some of these books are out of print or very rare. And if you
Hmm.
can, and some of them I've even had it where it was library use only. I couldn't take it home. I just had
Hmm.
to use it in the library and like maybe with the white gloves. Not quite, but
Mm.
almost.
And even if they do charge you, it's far less than buying
Mhm.
some of
Yes,
those books would be. So, yeah,
yes,
Mhm.
interlibrary loan and librarians, the best.
you
Yes.
bet. So, talking about some of all of your books, your whole body of work, how do you choose what topic or biography to write about? And how long does it really take you from like the first nibble of an idea to the finished book?
Okay, well, two slightly different questions, and
Hmm.
I will concentrate on women warriors
Hmm.
and the dragon from Chicago for this answer because the other books were really very different in that they were
Hmm.
work for hire books and
Mm.
Heroines of Mercy Street, for instance, I wrote in relation as the nonfiction companion volume to the PBS series Mercy Street.
Right.
Mm.
They came to me with the idea. I was all in, but they came to me with the idea, and I had to write, research, and revise that book in 4 months. That's
Wow.
Wow.
precisely.
Holy cow.
There were a lot of really long days there, and
Wow.
so, but that's not the norm. So for
Thank
books
goodness.
where I'm choosing the topic, first of all, the topic really just has to grab me by the throat. I can't have any doubt about wanting to do it because not only will I be spending years writing it, but then I will be spending years talking about it. I mean, Women
Mm.
Warriors came out in 2019, and I'm talking to you today.
Yeah.
So it's just got to be a book you can live with. And certainly right now, I'm in the process of trying to find the next topic, and I've already rejected several because I don't think I can live with them. And at least one of those somebody really needs to write, but it's
Mm.
not me. And then once one has me by the throat, then the next one is right back to the sources question. Are there archives? Where are they? Are they accessible? I mean, obviously, Women Warriors, it wasn't where their archives, it was how do I figure this out? But for the Dragon from Chicago, there were two major archives that I had access to, and we'll get to that in a moment because there's that with an asterisk. So those are the two questions. It's got to grab me by the throat, and there's got to be enough sources to write the book. Because unlike you novelists, I can speculate, but I can't actually make something up. If I speculate, it still has to be firmly based on something. As far as how long it takes, I actually went back and checked the timing on the two books because I thought they were going to turn out to be very different. In fact, both books took me 5 years from when I started the proposal to when the finished book was released.
Wow.
It's a commitment.
It's a
Hmm.
commitment. And in the case of Dragon from Chicago, that was a little longer than it otherwise might have been because we made a deal on the book in March of 2020.
Oh, wow.
Whoops.
So it's like, well,
Yeah.
dang, and now I can't get to those two archives. So what am I getting? So that added time, though ultimately I'm not sure the amount of time would have been any different, just the way it unrolled would have been different. So my first experience of writing an archive-based book was wearing a mask, having to make appointments that otherwise you wouldn't have to make. That the
Mm.
Madison archive opened that summer briefly, but for like 3 days a week for 6 hours a day. And so I was, instead of just going and staying for a month, I was going back and forth. My husband, who is astonishing, drove me week after week, because otherwise I'd have taken the bus and that didn't feel safe. So,
Mm-mm.
yeah, so Dragon from Chicago might not have taken 5 years, but my guess is it still would have taken 4. It is a
Wow.
commitment.
I love that
It's got to
title.
grab you by the throat.
Yeah.
I love that title so much, The Dragon from Chicago. And it was an actual something somebody called her, right? A real.
Yeah, Hermann Goering, who was Hitler's right-hand man, got pissed off at her and called her that dragon from Chicago. And after that, that's what his staff called her, and she wore that title with pride.
Oh,
Yeah,
good.
good for her.
So, in Women Warriors, you mentioned 3 stories that are really near and dear to our hearts.
Hmm.
Um, and the Birka Woman is one of them. Of course, the Oseberg burial ship, which is my favorite subject, and Ethelfled, the Lady of the Mercians. So let's talk about them.
Well, the odds are that both of you know more than I do about both the Birka Woman and the Oseberg ship. But yeah, let's talk about them. Because I mean the discovery that the Birka Woman was the Birka Woman, not the Birka man, was an enormous
It
change.
was.
I mean,
Mhm.
it was huge. I mean, 130 years it had been accepted without question that this was a iconic Viking burial. It wasn't
Yes.
just that it was a warrior burial, it was kind of the definitive warrior burial. And as soon as they know it's a woman, they go, well, maybe not. Maybe, I mean, at first they say, well, maybe the bones got mixed up. Maybe the guy back in the 19th century screwed up because archaeology was kind of grab ass then.
But
But
not him, not
but not
Stoller.
him. No, DNA proved conclusively that it was a woman and that they were all the bones were from the same person.
And he labeled them all.
And he labeled them all. Yeah, well, when you've upset their world, people are very happy to badmouth someone in the past and say he screwed it up. But he didn't. He was very careful.
And there wasn't room in the grave. There wasn't
There
really
wasn't
like a
room in the grave
space
for
for
there to
like
be
it
two
didn't look like,
people.
yeah.
That was one of the other things they said was, well, maybe there was another guy in here, a man in here also earlier, and where he went, we don't
Right.
know. But that would explain everything. I mean, the thing about both this and the Oseberg ship is the extent to which scholars were prepared to stretch to argue that it's not a woman. Now, the thing with the Birka woman is that discovery ultimately changed the questions we ask.
Mhm.
So that now, when there's a new discovery, people don't just assume that if there are weapons, that it's a man, or at least most people don't. It's changed the question, and it also means that some more sophisticated questions are being asked. The discovery that Kazimierz Pulaski, the Polish count who basically turned the Americans into an actual revolutionary army, was female, really shocked
Wow.
the world. But there was every reason to believe that, in fact, he was intergender and
Mm.
so now at least that possibility also gets raised, that some of these may be intergender, but it's opened up the questions we ask, and consequently we're seeing lots more discoveries being recognized as possibly being women.
Or
Lots of,
reevaluated, old ones
or
reevaluated.
Hmm.
yeah, and occasionally, if there's reason to go back to an older set of remains, the option of testing is there, though that's expensive and nobody's going to go back and check everything. That would be interesting if they did.
It would.
There's some DNA testing on samurai remains from battles in Japan have showed that about a third of the fallen samurai are women. That's not incidental.
It's
You
not
know,
insignificant at
it's
all.
not insignificant. And even if some of them were intergender, that wasn't a third of the army.
Mhm.
So, you know, the that ability and the fact that we started to use that technology changes the game from an archaeological perspective.
And that revelation came right in the middle of you working on women warriors. It seems
Yes,
like
it
it
did.
was
It
2017, I
was,
believe that Birka
yeah, it was
581.
2017 that it came out, and it was like, holy jamama. Um, and of course, the woman who I think has done the best job of talking about this for a popular audience is Nancy Marie Brown. I think
Yes.
her work on that is just brilliant, just absolutely brilliant. And I know you've had her on, so I'll just refer people back to your earlier episode and not try to reproduce her material. Um,
Yeah.
the Oseberg ship is different because nobody ever doubted that it was women. They just doubted they owned the boat. Um,
Or that
and
they actually had any power.
or they actually had any power. And I think that now most scholars, in fact, accept that it was their ship. They did have power. Um, but for a long time, you also got just crazy, crazy parents. I mean, my absolute favorite, and I couldn't believe it because I'm reading along in the scholarly stuff, and this guy's saying, and then there was this guy who posited that in fact that the boat had belonged to a man and that he had been buried with the ship, and that then his remains had been removed later for ritual purposes and had been removed so carefully that they left no trace in the soil. I mean, that was one of those times where I'm sitting in the university library reading it, and I just started laughing, just hysterically, and had to kind of run away and go hide in the bathroom so I wasn't disrupting. But I mean, that's not how archaeology works, buddy. And it was a serious scholar who had suggested it. So in the Oseberg ship, it's a different set of questions, but it's again Ethelflaed. Oh God, I love Ethelflaed.
Oh,
I
wait,
know.
before we move on,
Sure.
I just think it's so interesting that these people will just bend themselves over backwards and twist themselves into knots. Anything but that, BJ 581, the Birka woman, was a woman,
Yep.
or that the women at least one of the women in the Oseberg ship burial was powerful and rich enough to own this boat. And,
Yep.
it's just, and still, that was 2017 when they found out that BJ 581 was a woman. And yet still, these archaeologists were coming up with any kind of excuse or
Yep.
explanation that anything but that she actually was a woman. And it just goes to show that we still have a long way to go.
And one of the things that was so discouraging for me is that some of the people who were arguing the most strenuously against her having been a warrior were the same women scholars who had otherwise opened up our understanding of women in the Viking world in bigger ways, and you would have thought they would have embraced it, and yet it poked them in some uncomfortable place, and
I don't understand. But
there's a lot of
fortunately, there's
heaven.
a whole huge movement of archaeologists that are going the other direction and they're, finding the truth. Thank goodness.
Yep.
Yeah, and asking those questions that
And asking those
Pamela, you were
questions.
talking about.
Yeah, yeah, because I mean, just sometimes getting your brain open to ask a new question is all it
Mhm.
takes.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Or who were we talking to, Johanna? Was it Heather Pringle who said that maybe BJ 581 had been like a horse warrior? Like she had maybe
Yeah.
somebody was studying that maybe
Hmm.
she had
It
written
was Heather
and
Pringle, yeah.
okay, yeah, that she had talked to somebody who was like maybe she was because she had all of the accoutrement of somebody from
Mhm.
the east, so maybe and there were the arrows from the east, so maybe
And
she
even
was a
though she
horsewoman
was
too.
she was not genetically from the East, but that
Mhm.
she
Right.
was, strongly influenced by that culture. So,
Well, and people traveled more than we realize. I
Mhm.
mean, even though
yes.
most people didn't, more people did than we are taught in high school history classes.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, oof. What we're taught about the the Middle Ages and the early Middle Ages. It's just the Dark Ages. It's like like everybody like in that Monty Python and the Holy Grail with the guy in the muck. Help, help, we're being repressed. Everybody thinks that was the actual life of everybody in the Middle Ages.
I know.
It's kind of
Yeah,
tragic.
yeah. Though we don't do much better on any other. I mean, our introduction to history is by and large simplified to a degree that it's not astonishing at how many people tell me they hated history in high school.
Yeah.
Quite frankly, I hated history in high school, and I was still already a history buff. So,
Yeah, yeah, all that focus on wars and battles and dates and it wasn't until I got
legislation.
into yeah, it wasn't until I got into college and I actually took some, classes that were all about the US Civil War or all about the early Middle Ages or something like that. And we talked about a lot more than
Mhm.
just this battle happened on this date and this is who won. And yeah, that's when I really got interested in it. When it was more about, and then that was the late 80s. So that was about when things were starting to be a little bit more, let's start studying the regular people. Let's see what women were doing. Let's see what more
Yeah,
marginalized people were doing. So that was
yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, even art history, I had to memorize all these slides. I mean, I had to know the date, the artist, the style, the country. And it was like, for the midterm, 60 slides and 120 for the final. And it's like, why? I had more interesting papers to write in physics. Anyway, so yeah, on to Ethel Flood
She is so amazing.
is.
I mean, she definitely is one of my favorites. I knew nothing about her before I started this project. And, she is a critical figure, as you all know, in the unification of England and basically of ending the Danish rule of England. And yet, the major source, which is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, mentions her only as Edward the Elder's sister, does not even
Mhm.
mention her title, Lady of the Mercians. And in that case, it's one of those clear attempts to mold the story that they are needing to make Edward the Elder this pivotal figure. And he loses some of his heroic force if you have to admit that his big sister was a major player in the thing. But I mean, and again, I'm telling the story for the people who aren't in the room right now because you all know it, but she she follows her husband, the Lord of the Mercians, becomes a ruler in her own right after his death. She's the only female ruler in the Anglo-Saxon period and one of the few women to rule in their own right in the medieval period at all. Most rule either as a regent or in the name of their husband. And in one way that she's probably accepted is because, in fact, she is half Mercian. I mean, she's the daughter of Alexander the Great, but she's also the daughter of the King of Mercia, the predecessor to Altheda's Ethelfed's husband. And she builds fortresses. She leads troops against the Danes. She leads a consortium against Irish, Norwegian invaders from Brittany. I mean, she is a major figure. And in this last big push to drive the Danes out, she is winning critical battles. And in fact, right before her death, one of the Danish strongholds, York, the Christian Danes who are tired of being ruled by a pagan ruler, come to her and offer to pledge their loyalty to her. They don't go to Edward, they come to Ethelfled. And unfortunately, she dies before she's able to consolidate that. If she lived, I think the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles would have had to have told a slightly different story. But
Hmm.
after her death, her brother does finish the consolidation of England, but then he removes his niece, her daughter, from her throne. She
Yep.
disappears from history, and Ethelfled practically disappears from history. The only reason we know how important she is there's a Mercian document that, in fact, tells the story of her mother, of Ethelfled, and of her daughter. Very specifically, it leans into that context. It makes it clear how fragile what we know is. At
Hmm.
some level, there are people who write. I mean, women get written out of history, but also fire and time and dirt and insects destroy sources as well, particularly for the older periods. And it's just chance that that Mercian document survives.
It is. We're very lucky.
Is the study called, is it historiography? Where people study how we study history? Is that
Mhm.
one? Yeah,
Yeah.
I've always found that really fascinating. Like when you go back and look at something like that, like her just getting cut out of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, it's not it's not because she didn't do anything, it's because somebody literally cut her out of history. And so
Right.
I think it's really important, even those of it, when we're writing historical fiction, to remember, like when people talk about historical accuracy, well, what does that even mean? If I'm
Right.
writing about Ethelfled and she's hardly in any documents,
Hmm.
well, how historically accurate is our history? There's just biases everywhere when you're
This,
when
yeah,
you're
the sources, you
studying.
always have to remember who wrote the source and
Yeah.
why.
Right. Yeah.
Um, which is, and I did make sure that I wrote down this one thing about Ethelfled because it's important. It's William of Malmesbury, who is an English historian. He's writing 200 years after she died, and he described her as a warrior who protected men at home and intimidated them abroad. And he said she ought not to be forgotten as she was a powerful accession to Edward's party.
Nice.
Even 200 years after her death, we've got a historian saying, wait, let's look more closely at this.
Good for him.
Yes. Well, that kind of leads us on to the next question, which is, can you discuss how and why female combatants have been relegated to the shadows, shoved out of history, denied, and how and why that attitude still persists today? Do you have any insight
First,
into that?
yeah, how is easier than why
Yeah.
is the beginning. And it does happen in a lot of ways. And, some of them are benign. I mean, the women who disguise themselves as men to fight, if their disguise doesn't fail, they don't enter the historical record. If they fight to the end and then go home and put their skirt back on, unless they leave a diary that tells us they don't enter. The ones we know about, for the most part, got caught. So that those are people who, in some ways, erase themselves. Um, but there are a lot of ways they get defined out of being warriors. One of my favorite examples of this happened in World War II. Women and men both worked on the anti-aircraft guns. And the women were
Yes.
able to do everything the men did except basically fire the gun. And because they were not allowed to fire the gun, the Brits were able to classify them as non-combatants. And though
Mm.
they're standing right next to the guy who pulls the gun. So over and over, I would see women who were there who got treated as not fighting because of a definition.
Mm.
Obviously we get women being written out of the sources by their contemporaries or by people writing later. That's often for a political reason. Sometimes it may not even be conscious. Sometimes people are writing it from their own biases. And then the historians who come later look at those sources, look at the sources you're very familiar with, and say, oh, well, this is folklore, this is a myth, this is
Mhm.
not real, even though they'll use those same sources to prove something about a man. They'll come back through and work those same sources in a different way. And um, there were a couple of times where I saw women being described as metaphors, and it's in at least one case for a woman who we had every reason to believe actually existed. I mean, she's in the 16th century in Africa, but and again, you've got the same problem that the major sources for her were written down couple of hundred years later, but it's someone writing down oral histories. It's not just somebody writing. But yeah, I mean, she's a contemporary of Elizabeth Tudor, the first Queen Elizabeth, and yet they're saying, well, maybe she wasn't real. Maybe she's just a metaphor. So that's later historians basically erasing this, and the problem is it's all cumulative. So after a while, once you don't believe women fought, then it's easier to not see them or to say, well, they were there, but they didn't really fight, or yeah, she fought, but she was an exception, and that doesn't change the story in any big way. I mean, there's a reason so many women who lead or who are part of nationalist movements get described as the Joan of Arc of wherever they are, because Joan of Arc did change the story. You can't erase her.
That makes me think of Lagertha and Ragnar Lothbrok.
Mhm.
Like he's semi-legendary, but people tend to talk about him as if he's real. But Lagertha doesn't always get the same
All right. Respect.
respect. Yeah. And she did a lot of, I mean, according to the saga that she's in, she was fighting. Like she came to help him out with chips and stuff. And then of course she was maligned afterwards. But yeah, and I remember somebody saying to me once about how she really real? And I'm like, well, was Ragnar Lothbrok really real? Was King
Exactly.
Arthur really real? Like so
I do think that show Vikings did a lot to enhance Lagertha's
true.
reputation and to give us, that was before that show kind of went off the rails, but they really did a good job with her, I thought. So back to why.
Well, and I think why begins with part of sort of the larger erasure of women from history, which doesn't just happen with women warriors. And there we're basically talking just long-term systemic sexism,
Mhm.
plain and simple. But that gets complicated for women warriors because you've also got this long-standing debate, certainly in the West, that says that women shouldn't fight and maybe therefore didn't fight. And it's a really old debate. I mean, Plato suggests that in his perfect world that women should be trained exactly the same way men are with horses and soldiers and says, but people are going to laugh this out of court. So it's a really old debate, and it is tied in many ways to ideas about what it means to be female and then consequently what it means to be male. So that if being a warrior is only for men, if you question that, you're not just questioning the composition of an army, you're questioning the definition of manhood.
Wow, that's
That
big.
it is
Good
big,
answer.
and there's a reason that it continues to be controversial. And I would suggest that in fact that is one reason, occurs to me that one reason there are people who are being so angry about transsexuals is that in fact it questions the definition of what it is to be male.
Mm-hmm.
Mm,
100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
very well put.
Yeah. So
Um,
I have a question about the different kinds of cultures. So you had said that horse-based cultures and honor-based cultures and more tribal societies are more accepting of those female warriors than large empires or standing armies. Can you expand on that? Like where the difference would be?
and here we are in pure speculation because
Okay.
this is something that I noticed. This is not one of those
Educated
things.
speculation.
It's educated speculation, but it is not a statement that you're going to pick up anybody else's book and find them making that claim. It is my speculation. Um, and in some ways, it all comes down to the word regiment, that
Mm,
these are societies that are less regimented, whereas with standing armies, for the most part, the regiment or some central unit is part of that structure. These other societies don't tend to have that kind of structure. And in fact, one thing we see is that in the 18th century in the West, as armies become more professionalized, some of the ways in which women had been officially part of the army, even if they weren't actively fighting, if they had been part of the camp help, that starts to disappear as the armies become more professionalized. So some of it really is simply that these societies are organized differently and they fight differently. They tend to fight as individuals where they're all on the same side, but you don't have someone leading the army, you don't have someone directing the course of battle. And one place you find that really clearly is Boudica standing up against the Roman legion, where her soldiers, each man fights for him with himself, and their weapon is designed for an individual heroic fighter. And the Romans are in lines and they are trained to fight together, and they use their shields almost as a group weapon. So that part of it is just this very different idea about how you fight. Part of it is that horses are a real equalizer in
Hmm.
terms of physical strength. I mean, I think there's a reason that little girls really like horses often is it lets you be bigger and stronger and move faster than you otherwise can. So fighting on horseback is a great equalizer. Again, in these cultures that are not wearing heavy armor, I mean, once you're back to medieval knights in armor, the horse changes things. Um, and then also a lot of these cultures do have some room for a leadership role for women, even if it's not a major one. Often there is a spiritual leadership. Often there's a possibility for a woman leader. And I think that makes a difference as well. Again, this is all my speculation. Nobody has written about this that I know of, but it was so striking to me how many of those cultures were more welcoming. And the one that's kind of different from every other one are the samurai, where it's a social class, not a job. And
Mm.
the samurai women are trained to use weapons, even though whether or not they were expected to go into battle, they were trained to use weapons so they could defend themselves and their family's honor. That's something that doesn't happen in 18th century England. It or medieval England, even though there are women there who certainly know how to handle a military force. I mean, if only to protect their husband's castle if their husband's away.
So, do you have a favorite woman warrior? And why did you pick her?
Favorite is hard, but I definitely have one that I was most excited to learn. And in fact, went running down the stairs to tell my husband, "You're never going to believe this." Um, Alexander the Great had an older half sister named Hinane, and she commanded Macedonian troops under her father's leadership. Um, she was trained as a fighter because her mother came from Illyria, which was one of these horse-based cultures where noble women learned to ride and to shoot arrows and to fight on horseback. And actually, Kinani not only leads armies for her father as they are expanding north, but she one of the major source for her says that she defeated an Illyrian army and defeated the Illyrian queen in hand-to-hand combat, which
Ooh.
means that's
Oh,
probably the only known battle in history in which both commanders were women. And once Alexander takes over, she exits the story for a while, but after his death, she returns to the story. He died, and there was no obvious heir to the throne because when he took power, he killed all of his possible rivals. The only one left standing was his half brother, also Kinani's half brother, who was mentally deficient because he'd been given poison that had not killed him, but had left him incapable. So he ended up being a puppet king. Several of Alexander's generals were working as the power behind the throne. Kinani also wanted to be the power behind the throne because she had 2 out of the 3 qualifications to take over, and the one she didn't have was being male. So she mobilized troops and went to war against the generals with the idea of forcing a marriage between her daughter and the puppet king that would leave Kinani the power behind the throne instead of the generals. And they get there, and the troops recognize her. I mean, they knew who she was. She was a heroic general under their former leader, so they weren't quite sure. One of the kings kills her in front of all the men, and it just creates an uprising. So she gets what she wants. Her daughter is married to the puppet king, but she doesn't live to enjoy being the ruler behind the throne. But just, she's not forgotten. Any scholar of Alexander has to know about her because she's in one of the major sources the story is told. But I just couldn't believe it. It's like, what? Alexander the Great's older half-sister? You're kidding me. I can't pick a favorite, but that is definitely the one I was the most excited about.
That is a very cool story. She should make a movie about her.
Yeah.
Well, she is a playable character in a number of video games.
Oh, is she? Okay.
Yes.
Good to know.
Very cool. So do you have anything else that we haven't covered that you need to say about these women warriors? We've covered a lot.
We've covered a lot, and just, we were always there. I mean, it's that simple. Is women always fought? And I guess the one thing I would say is that the largest type of woman warrior, which I didn't expect, were ordinary women who fought to defend their homes in sieges. And I mean, that's such an accepted thing that there's a ancient Chinese statesman who calls them the army of adult women and urges commanders to use them to the fullest extent possible. Just women who pick up whatever is there to pick up and stand at the barrier to defend their home. We were there.
Yeah. We've been there all along. I love that. Well, before we go, you released the book about Sigrid Schultz, the dragon from Chicago. Do you want to, what did it come out? Late last year? Late 2024?
Last August, yeah.
2024. You want to tell our listeners a little bit about Sigrid? What an interesting woman, and what a timely time to be releasing a book about journalism in Nazi Germany.
Yes. Nazi Germany. Sure, I will give you the quick version of Sigrid Schultz. She was the Chicago Tribune's Berlin bureau chief from 1925 to 1941. She was one of so she reported on the rise of the Nazis, and she actually worked for the Tribune from 1919 on. So she spoke 5 languages. She knew seemingly everyone in Germany, and she reported on the rise of the Nazis step by step. She was one of the first American reporters to warn their readers about just how dangerous the Nazis were. She was one of the last to manage to leave before it became impossible to do so. And then in her 50s, she went back as a war correspondent.
Wow.
Which made
That's amazing.
I mean, there were roughly 200 women who went as war correspondents. Only 2 of them were in their 50s. That meant she was older than almost all the men who were doing it.
Wow.
She was amazing. She was absolutely amazing.
How brave. Didn't she, I mean, I haven't read it yet. It's on my to be read list, but I remember you talking about her just like standing up to these Nazis, and like,
yeah,
she
I mean,
sounds
the
amazing.
reason Hermann Goering calls her the dragon from Chicago, they're at a foreign correspondent luncheon. He's there as the guest of honor because, they didn't like him, but you had to keep contact with your sources. And she basically stood up in front of all of them and called him out on these attempts they were making to trap foreign journalists as spies by feeding them information they shouldn't have. And she just said, we're not that stupid. Nobody's going to run this stuff. You might as well stop. I mean, right to his face. He lost his temper and said, you're never going to learn. You're never going to learn to respect authority. That must be coming from that crime-ridden city of Chicago, which cracks me up every time I think about it compared to Berlin. And then after that, they called her the Dragon from Chicago.
Nice. What a great story.
Yes. I'm sure she relished the title.
I have no doubt about it. She was one tough broad.
Nice. Well, that's a perfect place to end. Is there any place or anything you want our listeners any place to look for you, or you got anything coming up?
I don't know what's coming up. I'm still looking. My website is www.PamelaDToler.com. I have a blog that comes out twice a week called History in the Margins. And then I have a newsletter that comes out twice a month, and there's nowhere to find that other than on the website or to sign up.
That's a great place.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much for joining us. That was great.
What a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. You can find Johanna at johannawittenberg.com, where you'll find a free short story, a prequel to her Norse Queen series. And you can find me, K.S., at ksbarton.com, where you can also find a free short story from me, a prequel to my Norse family series. See you next time.